Hello everyone, Sage here. Welcome to the Executive Corner, the Expert Talks. And today we have a special guest called Mr. Matthew Mckenzie. He's a business journalist from Business News Australia. And as you know, we bring you the industry leaders, successful business owners, market and equity advocates, all under the one roof to help you discover the insights of the stock markets and help you understand how one can create multiple passive income streams. So today we're very lucky to share some space with Matt Mckenzie, a busy journalist with Business News Australia. And to give you some background, Business News has a team of dedicated business journalists offering unrivaled insights into the success of the leading entrepreneurs, executives and industry leaders, in their own words. So without any further delay, let's focus on Matt to hear his valuable insights. Welcome, Matt. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Hello, excited to be here. Hopefully my screen's working okay and everything's all good.
Looks great from what I can see. So we've learned that you often report on politics. On a related note, we'd love to find out more about Prime Minister Scott Morrison's recent visit to Western Australia. Mr. Morrison recently paid his first visit to WA in almost 18 months, was it, to talk about the economy and the government's investment in apprenticeships. Do you think it was a move to shore up WA's support for his next federal election?
Well, I think it's always good to have politicians getting out and about and listening to people. And I think Anthony Albanese came through in the last couple of months as well. I kind of understand why it's been a while for Mr. Morrison, because the state's borders were closed for a good period of that time, thanks to the pandemic. And, you know, I think in Western Australia, we think of things a little bit differently than maybe some of the other places around the country. There's always diverse opinions around Australia. And one of the things he talked about while he was here was the resources industry up in the Pilbara, which is going to be difficult, potentially, for these resources businesses to reduce their emissions. So he went up there, he spoke to a business event in Karratha and talked about basically, he said it'll be working with them, it'll be the businesses and their innovation and ingenuity that help bring the country to net zero by 2050. So it's part of that sort of move that he's been making towards being a little bit more ambitious, perhaps, in his carbon emission targets. And the other thing is, in terms of the political impact, during the pandemic, there was a big dispute about the state's borders. The Premier wanted to keep them closed so that people didn't come in from other states and bring the pandemic or bring COVID potentially across. And that was very popular here. Scott Morrison and the local Liberal opposition didn't agree with the policy, so that could be a problem for him when it comes to the federal election.
Right, very interesting insights there. Thank you for shedding some light on the situation. And as per the latest CommSec State of the States report, Western Australia made a huge leap in terms of economic performances over the first quarter of 21, overtaking the growth reported in some other states. And according to you, what would you see as the key factors driving that impressive growth in WA?
We saw some very strong GDP data out nationally this week. And in terms of state final demand, which is a figure that doesn't include exports and imports, but it's the one that the ABS publishes more regularly, WA's economy has grown really significantly. It was the strongest growth of any state. I think it was 3% in the most recent quarter. And if you compare the bottom of the recession, when we went through the lockdown in the June quarter, I think it was last year, WA's economy has grown by 10% in state final demand terms since then. So a very significant improvement. Now, looking at the data, one of the big things has been investment by the mining industry in new equipment, plant and equipment and machinery. I think the number was up by 20% in terms of investment in equipment. So there's a bit of a mining boom building. And then on top of that, trade data in the 12 months to April, another figure out this week, WA exported more than $200 billion of merchandise over that 12-month period, and that is a record. So very much a resources-led boom over here at the moment, I think.
Wow, incredible. Thank you for those impressive stats as well. A recent data from the Real Estate Institute of WA, the REIWA, showed that 7 out of 9 regional centres across WA saw property values increasing over the past quarter, which we've also seen over in the east as well. And according to you, what has been driving this property market surge in WA?
Well, there's reason to be confident, I think, as the economy rebounds. And also interest rates are quite low, in fact, record lows across the country. The RBA set them at record lows. Something to think about in terms of the regions is, it goes back to this theme earlier, when the resources industry is booming, then usually the regions are booming. And so particularly at the moment, it's a little bit more difficult for someone to fly in, fly out from other parts of the country. If resources industry, if mining businesses, oil and gas businesses are making investments, there's an incentive there for people to go out and move into regional centres to buy houses, so they'll have a place to work, so they'll have a place to live while they work on site. So that's one reason I think that demand has gone up in regional areas. Probably the other thing is that after the pandemic, people are much more comfortable about working electronically, working from home. People are maybe a little bit less keen to live in big cities. So property prices are up in Perth. But I think the numbers you're citing in the regional areas reflect, the resources industry and perhaps a change in people's preferences away from big cities.
Exactly. And a little bit more space in regards to social distancing as well, I suppose.
That's right.
So moving on to the next part of the discussion, the WA government recently launched up to $1.5 million investment in funding research and development in Western Australia's energy and emissions intensive mining sector. And do you think it will support the government in achieving the net zero carbon emissions by 2050? You've touched on this a little, discussing Prime Minister Morrison's visit. Could you elaborate?
Sure. And I'll add, I think Scott Morrison also announced around the same time about $1 billion of investments in trying to encourage technology, low emissions technology, carbon capture and hydrogen. And so the interesting thing about this is 15 years ago, wind and solar power weren't particularly competitive, but now, in particular circumstances, they are. There's some modelling from some investment banks that suggest wind power is cheaper than new build coal. Of course, there's also the storage. You have to store it, you have to back it up with batteries or pumped hydro. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But certainly the numbers are coming in pretty well for wind power compared to where they were 10 or 15 years ago. The cost has come down a lot. Similarly, with solar, the cost has come down a lot. And so if you have a regional town, it is actually potentially easier to have a solar farm if it's in the desert, like much of Western Australia is. It's easier to have a solar farm and some batteries and potentially a gas turbine to back it up than having the town connected to a very long power grid powered by coal from the state's southwest. So we're in an interesting situation where microgrids, solar and batteries can be more competitive for uses in regional areas, including potentially for mining. And what we really need is for the same process to happen with hydrogen and with carbon capture and storage. It's been a 10, 15-year development for solar and wind. We need the same thing to happen in hydrogen so that we get to a point where we can competitively export hydrogen. And we need to be in a point where we can competitively capture carbon and store it underground. And if you think about it, there are these huge gas reserves off Western Australia's coast that have been, they've produced gas over many decades. We put it as LNG and shipped it overseas. We can use those fields, we can use those reservoirs now to store carbon. So it's all about technological investment. $1.5 million may not necessarily be a very significant number, but it's about encouraging development of technology that's going to really bring emissions down.
Absolutely. Thank you again for sharing those valuable insights. And I think WA has been quite successful at keeping their energy costs in regards to natural gas quite low for the domestic population as well in the past. And it'll be interesting to see if some production partnerships can be beneficial to keeping the costs low for other renewable energies such as hydrogen and carbon capture sources, as you've mentioned. And moving on, we have seen that you frequently reported on economics besides energy and politics. And on that note, we would love to ask you, where does the Australian economy stand relative to other developed economies in its road to revival from the COVID-19 pandemic? Has the Australian economy completely shaken off the pandemic blues, in your opinion?
Well, I guess there's always a risk, as we see in Victoria now, of the pandemic blues, as you've said, returning if there's a COVID outbreak. But I think what we've seen in terms of jobs data, in terms of GDP data, is that Australia is almost back to where it was before the pandemic, or better, depending on which indicator you want to use. So things are going very strongly. And that's the case also in some other countries. In the September quarter, I think last year, the US economy had record growth as they recovered from lockdowns, and we're seeing a lot of countries that are entering this recovery mode. And perhaps the big question is what we're going to do to deal with inflation, Sage.
Exactly. It'd be interesting to see how that develops. And looking forward, do you think the slow rollout of the vaccination program, which is gaining pace now, thank goodness, could decelerate the pace of economic growth in Australia?
Well, I think it's all about the potential for a COVID outbreak. And obviously, the more people are vaccinated, the less of a risk. It's kind of like a shield against a potential future outbreak. The more people are vaccinated, the better off we will be if there is an outbreak. But we've been very fortunate in Australia with border closures. We've been quite lucky that we've been able to isolate almost from the rest of the world. It's not something we can do forever, but it's something that's worked so far in terms of keeping the pandemic out. So that is going to be very important. And then the question is going to be with the vaccinations, at what point are we going to be ready to open up to the rest of the world? And if the vaccination rate stays low for a long term, then that could cause a problem in terms of the economic impact too.
Exactly. That would be a major incentive, I think, to get people registered to vaccinate against COVID. Do you think, we're actually coming to an end of our discussion shortly, so hopefully we'll fit a couple more discussion points in. Do you think the recently released big spending federal budget would result in overheating of the Australian economy?
That's a great question, and I think it's a risk, and I think it's a question more people should be asking. And a lot of the spending in this budget, the federal budget, has been very long term. It's for programs which are very important. The National Disability Insurance Scheme, aged care, these are important parts of our society. But these spending initiatives will be locked in for a long time. They're effectively forever commitments to improve outcomes in social services. And that's going to mean bigger government, it's going to be more spending. The government hasn't really made clear what its eventual path will be, and it doesn't need to be right now, but it hasn't made clear what its eventual path will be to get out of deficit, which could be a problem. And the other thing to consider here is that when governments are spending more money, usually they're less efficient than the ASX listed companies that you'd be familiar with, which are very careful with how they spend money. Private business is very careful. We have infrastructure projects happening in WA where the government is spending a lot of money, even though their own assessments have told them it's not really worth doing. And yet, if you're a mining business, if you're a small mining company, you're wanting to do some exploration, or even if you own a cafe or a hotel or what have you, it's hard to get workers. So the government's putting more pressure on the economy by increasing its spending, potentially on projects that aren't that useful, while if you're a trucking company, you can't find workers for love or money at the moment.
Right. Thanks for sharing those insights. So there are some visible gaps there that are looking to be filled, hopefully, by, state governments? Not sure.
Yeah. So we do have a bit of a skill shortage problem here in WA at the moment. There was an announcement about, I think it was 1,000 new truck drivers that they'll be recruiting through a program. They'll be training and recruiting them. You mentioned the apprenticeships announcements earlier by Scott Morrison. And so that's, I think, what the question is going to be moving forward. We've recovered very strongly. Will we have the workers? Will we be able to find the workers to put into the businesses that really need them, that want to grow? Because, the resources industry, we talked about how incredible that data was, that export data, incredible data. But they're now starting to find problems. They can't get the truck drivers, or they can't get the people to drive the trains, or they can't find the engineers. Demand for chefs, I think, in another sector, vacancies for chefs up 70%, job vacancies for chefs up 70% in WA. People in construction, some roles, job vacancies more than doubled compared to 2 years ago. So there's a potential for a labour shortage, Sage.
Right. That's very interesting to hear. So where do you see the Australian economy heading in the next few years, apart from all what you've already mentioned? Sorry.
Well, one thing we need to focus on is how we can be more competitive and what we can do to support businesses to be able to compete internationally. We've been fortunate with the resources story that I talked about, but it's also very sadly, it's at the misfortune of, Brazil, where they had terrible issues managing COVID, unfortunately, and so their resources industry, their iron ore, was effectively shut down. In the long term, we will be dealing with competition from countries like Brazil again. Our grain farmers will be dealing with competition. Our oil and gas industry will be dealing with competition from places like Qatar and the US. So we have to think about what we can do to make sure that our businesses, our exporters, our industry, not just in resources, but in anything, even if it's the service industry, we have to create an economy where they can be competitive.
Exactly. Perhaps more investment into education and also manufacturing locally might be avenues they might want to consider. Who knows? But thank you so much for joining us.
Sorry.
Please.
Thank you, Sage. I appreciate it.
Your insights were extremely interesting and valuable. Hopefully our viewers feel the same way. So are you working on anything interesting at the moment that you'd like to share before we finish up today?
Yeah. So I'm doing a little bit on Asian engagement, which I guess goes to this point about how we manage our trade relationships. You'd be very well aware that there's been some political disputes with China. And a lot of people in WA are thinking about, they want to maintain the relationship with China very strongly, but how can we work with partners like India and Indonesia going into the future? So I'm exploring that at the moment. Very interesting.
Fantastic. I'll keep my eyes peeled for that article. And thanks again for joining us. And viewers, if you've just joined us, you can catch our discussion that we've just had with Matthew Mckenzie from Business News Australia on our YouTube channel via Kalkine Media. And this is Sage signing off. But as we say, stay apprised and invest wise with Kalkine.